So that means they're cellular components. The things that I expect you to know about the formed elements of the blood for the lab practical are just using the models as your guide, name them, okay? Then be able to tell me their prevalence, which means how many of them you have. This, for the most part, is per microliter of blood, super teeny tiny little drop. The ones I want you to know absolute numbers for, again, prevalence, are the red blood cells, which we're going to have a number of about 4.6 to 6.2 million per microliter. Okay. Then these guys down here, which are representatives of the thrombocytes or platelets, which you have about 240 to 460,000. Okay. 250 to 450,000 is a pretty good number. That's per microliter. Now those are the only ones that I want you to know the absolute numbers for. Okay. Everything else that you have listed here, these are all the white blood cells, which we would call leukocytes. Okay. The absolute numbers for the leukocytes are, your book goes a little low. They say about 5,500 to 9,000. Typically, I would say about 8,000 to 12,000 would be a normal white blood cell count. Okay. Again, per microliter. Now, after that, you don't have to know the absolute numbers for the different white blood cells. I just want you to know their percentages. Okay. So percentages of total white blood cells. So let's go in order. Okay. The most common white blood cell you have is this guy here, which is the neutrophil, okay, also called polymorphonuclear leukocytes or PMNLs, polys. So those are the neutrophils, and they make up about 60 to 80% of your peripheral white blood cells. Their hallmark is this string of pearls type nucleus arrangement where they have these lobes that are connected by thin tendrils. Usually 3 or 4, and a lot of times they'll even look like an N when you look at it in the microscope. Only white blood cell that has that arrangement. Okay. They should also be the most common white blood cells. So when you're looking in the blood smear and you see the ones that are stained purple, those are the white blood cells, and 60 to 80% of those things should be this type. So if you're seeing a lot of these, they're neutrophils. Okay. They'll have granules that go from being light pink to bright pink, just depending on how intensely that slide is stained. These are the first responders. So the 3 things that I asked you to do on the test is name them, tell me their prevalence, and just a very brief description of their function, right? 2 or 3 things at most. I mean, I only ever ask for 1, but there's only a couple of characteristics I'm having you learn. For the neutrophils, it's that they're short-lived phagocytes, they're the first responders, and that's about it that I'm really asking you to know about those. Okay, next most common type of white blood cell is the lymphocyte. It's this little guy over here. We have 2 models of lymphocytes. This is the immature lymphocyte like you find in a peripheral blood smear most of the time. The one that I don't really put out usually is this one, which is a mature lymphocyte, and they get a little bit more oblong, larger. I usually leave this one out because that just confuses things, okay? So we take the younger one here, that's an immature lymphocyte. These are the, so their numbers are 20 to 40% of your white blood cells total. They're the guys that activate your adaptive immune response. They're important in antibody response and cell-mediated immunity to a specific recognized pathogen. Okay. You have 2 types. You have T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. The T lymphocytes are what activate your cellular immunity. Your B lymphocytes are what produce what we call your humoral immunity. They produce antibodies. Okay. But they're both types of lymphocytes. And they have a real small, dense, compact nucleus and very little cytoplasm. So if you see cells in there that are fairly small, smaller than neutrophils, but a very dense, dark nucleus, those are almost always lymphocytes. And again, the numbers can be your guide. What's the most commonly confused cell type with this from when you looked at your smears? What was the one we had a hard time telling apart from this? Usually, well, it's a basophil. Yeah, yeah, usually the basophils. And so what I usually tell students is, look, if you think you're seeing 20 basophils in there, they're not basophils. Okay, those are almost certainly lymphocytes, because the basophils are very uncommon. So, you know, if you look at 100 white blood cells, you're lucky to find 1. Okay, basophils are much bigger than our lymphocytes. So lymphocyte little, basophil big. Okay, little, big. All right, moving on down the line, we would come to the monocyte next. It's going to be 4 to 8% of your total white blood cells. Okay, monocytes are going to mature into a macrophage. So as they're circulating around in your blood, they're monocytes. But when they get called out to do that diapedesis, where they crawl from the blood out into the tissues, then they morph into a phagocyte. And so when you find them in circulation, they're monocytes, but when you find them out in the tissue spaces, they're macrophages. They're the largest of the white blood cells, and generally speaking, they have this kind of beanbag-shaped nucleus, which always stains a little bit lighter than the nuclei of the other leukocytes. So if it looks, you have to be relative here, so if the neutrophils have a pretty darkly stained nucleus, this one will still be stained fairly dark, but it'll always be a paler blue than the other ones around it. And it usually is kind of big and takes up over half the cell, and like I said, it kind of looks like a beanbag as far as the nucleus. Okay. Fairly easy to find. I think most of you found those when you're looking in the smears. These, like neutrophils, are macrophages, but monocytes are long-lived macrophages. So they'll continue living for several months, whereas a neutrophil, once it engulfs something, it dies. So these are short-lived macrophages. Monocytes are long-lived macrophages. Okay. All right, and then that leaves us our last two remaining granulocytes, and those are in order of prevalence, eosinophils and basophils. Okay. So the eosinophils have the bright red neon sign granules that contain things like antihistaminase and heparin and things of that nature. Their main job is to fight parasitic worm infections. They're a class of white blood cells that are targeted at trying to destroy parasitic roundworms. Things like called nematodes. I don't know if you've heard of Ascaris or hookworm or any of those, but those are common roundworm infections. Their prevalence is about 1 to 2% of your white blood cells total. And then that leaves us this guy here, which is the basophil, another type of granulocyte. The basophil has these really dark granules, and they're so dark that usually they obscure the nucleus. It's hard to see the bilobe nature of the nucleus in these things. They're large. They're bigger than the neutrophils and the lymphocytes. So it helps if you can find them next to other things to compare to. Okay. I think in our class, I'm trying to think, I think we found one. I think there was one that I found a basophil in. And that's kind of how it goes. They're fairly uncommon, so you have to scan for a long time to be able to find one. So if I put it on the test, it's just the luck of the draw. When I set up the test, if in 5 minutes I find one, I put it on there, but otherwise you don't get it. You can always get a neutrophil, I can always find a lymphocyte, I can always find a monocyte. Right? Those three are always easy to find. The other two are a little bit dodgier. Okay. So prevalence of this, less than 1%, about 0.5% to 1%. And their main job is to promote inflammatory responses. They release things like histamine. Okay? So really, basophils and eosinophils, they work in conjunction. Basophils promote inflammation, and eosinophils turn it off. Right? Eosinophils release a chemical called histaminase, which breaks down histamine. So the two, when you're having an allergic reaction or an inflammatory reaction, you'll find both of those elevated. Easiest ones to counter these guys. So frequently, in a peripheral blood smear, they'll count the eosinophils as an indicator of an inflammatory response. But it's really the basophils that are causing it. And I think that about sums it up. The other part of it was simply to get the blood smear out and look at these in the blood smear. And there are pictures on Blackboard of pretty much all of them, too. Okay. Any questions? Go ahead.
What were the absolute cell counts again for the red blood cells and the platelets?
So the red blood cells, we'd say about 4.6 to 6.2 million per microliter. And for the platelets, about 250 to 450,000. And white blood cells, I would go about 8 to 12,000. Your book's a little lower. I think they say about 5.5 to 8. I'm not talking.